If you like my dad's videos, please subscribe to QA Insights channel.
Thank you everyone for joining. Let us wait for 1 more minute and then we can get started with today's topic. So today we are going to talk about performance engineering and accessibility. So let us hear from Eldad about his expertise on this topic. So last week we were discussing about how distributed load testing works, and before that we discussed about Terraform. So we have more technical sessions coming up in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned and watch out for the GitHub repository for all the recordings and the topics. So this week's sponsor, as you know, Redline 13. So Redline 13 being sponsored us from past many couple weeks. So this week again, Redline 13 is sponsoring us. So if you want to run very high scale load testing on cloud using JMeter, then Redline 13 is only the affordable solution for your testing needs. So please check it out at redline13.com. So last week, I think 2 weeks before, we had a conference from Redline 13. So please check it out, loadtestworld.com also. So Eldad also talked about performance topic, and myself, and there are a lot of other folks also shared their expertise. So please check it out. So without any further ado, let us get started with this today's topic from Eldad. Hi Eldad, how are you?
I'm doing great. Great to be here again. I was here before, and it feels good to come back to talk about some topics. And I think that today we have a really important topic to cover.
That's right, because accessibility is, I thought it's something related to automation or functional testing or compatibility testing, but I never related with the performance. So even I am very excited about to know about this topic with respect to performance.
Yeah, it is, and we will talk about the functional part because it is important. I think very soon we found that some topics that are not or seemingly not related to performance, all of a sudden they become very important to performance. So I think the topics become intertwined over time because they overlap in some cases.
Sure. So yeah, before we get started, so is it okay if the audience ask questions in between? Is it okay?
Absolutely, yes, and I think it's more appropriate in this case because accessibility, although the standardization, and we will talk about it, the standardization for accessibility started is like old, but companies didn't really pay much attention for it for a long time, and it has only been recently that it has become very important to a lot of companies, and there are multiple reasons for that. But it seems to be novel, even though it has been floating around for a while, but it's pretty novel. And because it's novel, there are a lot of unanswered questions. So I do think that it's best to have a discussion and come up with your questions, come up with your comments, with your experience. Of course, I think it's the best way to go.
Yeah, thank you. So if you want to ask any question, please raise your hand so that I can admit to the stage. Any point, you can interrupt Eldar and ask your question. Yeah, we can get started, Eldar.
Yeah, sure. So I think that first we need to define our terms. What is accessibility? So accessibility in a generalized term is how well a service, a device, a utility is suitable for the use of people with disabilities. Okay, so this is what we generally talk about. We talk about people who have disabilities, and there are many forms of disabilities, either cognitive disabilities, vision impairment, hearing impairment, motor disabilities, mental disabilities or mental disorders, and some environment has to be well adapted to serve them, to serve these people. And more specifically to our topic is web accessibility. So web accessibility is accessibility of websites or web products. People use the web for multiple purposes, and people with disabilities use them for exactly the same purposes. But if websites are not well adapted to serve them, they're going to face a lot of difficulties. And these difficulties are either related to their safety, They could be related to their well-being, their ability to get goods and services, their employment. So imagine you have some billing system or and any other work-related system, e-commerce or stuff like that, but it's not suitable for people with disabilities, so their employment opportunities diminish. And it's sad. It's really sad. So web accessibility is about the accessibility of web products. Now, the standard, the well-recognized standard for web accessibility is known as the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. It was devised by W3C. It's known by the acronym WCAG. That's the acronym. And its latest revision is 2.1. And it lists out 4 principles for web accessibility. The first one being perceivable. So the content has to be perceivable in multiple ways. So for people with vision impairments, text is not really a good option. So you need to have text alternatives. Operable. Okay, so people with disabilities have to be able to operate with these websites. And understandable. So there should be a really good distinction between the different components of your website. One guideline in this respect would be, for example, the contrast between the background and the foreground. Usually they recommend a 4.5 ratio of contrasts between the foreground and the background, and anything other than that is not really understandable for many people with disabilities. And the last one, the fourth principle, is robust. Okay, so robust means that your system has to be able to work together with assisting equipments. Now, there are countless of assisting equipments, and there are countless assisting equipments to come in the future. And none of us can see the future, of course, but the standards listed there are pretty straightforward, and we expect future assistant devices to be aligned with them. So if your website is aligned with these standards, then you have a really good chance supporting more devices or assisting devices in the future. And these 4 principles are subdivided into actual criteria. Okay, so these are measurable criteria, in total 78 such criteria, and they are divided into 3 levels of conformance. A, which is the bare minimum, so a subset of these 78 would be a qualification for A-level conformance. Double A, okay, which is all the requirements for level A plus additional ones. And AAA is meaning that you comply with all of the standards. So everything in AA and above that, and more of that. Now, AAA might not be realistic for many websites and many businesses. And a single A would be the bare minimum. You don't have to go through a lot of effort to be at A-level conformance. So for the most part, the overwhelming majority of businesses who try to improve their accessibility are trying to go from single A to AA. Okay, that would be the majority of cases.
Got it. So is it with respect to only to the colors, or is it all the aspects?
All the aspects. There's a very detailed guideline, and it can either be the borders, the boundaries around the components. It could be the text size, the text fonts. There are a lot of things that go into it. Now, of course, you might ask, okay, how am I going to remember all of that? Well, we will talk about the tools involved, and you're going to find that you don't really have to remember all of them by heart. So, yeah, that's it.
So this accessibility guidelines, is it for all the devices? I mean, as you mentioned, mobile, tablet, and desktop, correct?
Yes, and actually, this is one of the criteria that the responsiveness have to be adaptable. I think adaptable is part of the operable principle. So it means that if the user use a different kind of device, yes, it should adapt to it, and it should be, for example, if it's a picture, it should be well centralized, and it should be in the boundaries, and it doesn't have to scroll horizontally a lot. But it's okay if it has to scroll vertically. That's usually okay. That's the usual guideline. But yes, it's for all devices.
Got it. So I think this question might be, it's too early to ask, but still I'm asking. So how this correlates to the performance?
It is too early. I'm on the before then. I want to kind of touch on the topic of why is that important to go that route? Why accessibility really matters?
Sure. Yeah.
So I want to spend a few moments on that, and I will go to how it could correspond to performance, because there are more than two ways, but two main ways it could happen. So the first reason why you would actually want to go that route of accessibility is because it is the right thing to do. Okay, people with disabilities, and it has been demonstrated in multiple polls from all over the world, that people with disabilities very often feel excluded. They feel that they are not being taken seriously. They're overlooked, and I think it's a terrible feeling to live with, in conjunction with the disability. So I think that it is the right thing to do. If you look around you, you find people with disabilities that harms them in many ways. So I think it's a good thing to do. But the second part, if we go for more egoistic things, is it's a large audience. So according to the World Health Organization, we're talking about roughly around 1 billion people around the world. It's about 13% of the population. In the United States, it is estimated that 1 in 4 adults lives with one or another form of disability. So it's a huge audience. And making your website accessible to them immediately enlarges your customer base. The third thing is penalties. So legal penalties. In thinking in most countries around the world, there are laws for web accessibility, and non-conforming with them could lead to lawsuits and fines. In Israel, there are such laws. In the United States, there's the Americans with Disability Act. In Canada, in India, in Japan, there are laws in all over Europe. Even the European Union itself, the Internet Commission of the European Union, has such laws. So it is pretty much across the board. So there are lots of interests in accessibility, and that's the reason why we see the rise in accessibility interest in companies. And now that we know why we need it and what does it mean, we can talk about the tools, and then we can talk about how it relates to performance, because it has two ways of how it relates to performance: either how performance affects accessibility, and how accessibility can impact the efforts to construct performance tests. Okay, so it goes both ways, and we'll talk about both of them.
Cool.
So I would like to stop for a moment for if there are any questions so far.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So please raise your hand so that I can admit to the stage. If anybody has any questions. So I have one question, Eldad. So you mentioned, right, there is a penalty around if people are not conforming the accessibility guidelines. So do you know any company who has paid some fine by not abiding those rules?
I think that so far it was only small businesses. So because let's face the truth, large businesses can settle way before they go to trial, because they can drag this with paperwork for years, because they have the capital and the legal system or the legal support system to go through it. So it usually happens to small scale business.
Yeah. We have Sid here. Hi Sid, thanks for joining. Yeah, please shoot your question to Eldad.
Hey Naveen, hi Eldad.
Hey.
Yeah. So I heard your last Redline 13 speaking conversation and the scope of performance engineering. That is nice. And coming to the topic, yeah. So this accessibility, right? So I see the perspective like it depends on the app requirement, like whose requirement. It will come into the requirement. Like if the app is yours, if you think that there will be a disabled or impaired persons as a customers, you can implement. And if you don't think that there are no expectations of any impaired people, so it's not mandatory to implement the accessibility, right?
Well, first of all, there is no reason. Okay, actually, you brought up a very interesting question because we also have to take into account the flaws in the tech industry itself. I mean, it's not intentional flaws and it's not big flaws, but it is a flaw. And the major flaw in the tech industry is that the people who are involved in the tech industry, the developers, the QA professionals, the performance engineers, the DevOps, the designers, all of them are a very particular type. First of all, they're mostly young adults, so early 20s to early 40s. That's the people who do software for the most part. They're mostly men. They're mostly very healthy. They're mostly very intelligent. They are literate. Okay, so they have good reading comprehension skills. They are technically capable. Okay, they prove they are technically capable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be working in the tech industry. They are emotionally stable for the most part, but usually they are emotionally stable. And it is important. And I would like to bring that up for a moment, the emotional stability. Emotional stability means that these people are people in the tech industry usually are capable of delaying gratifications. And people with disabilities very often have difficulties delaying gratifications. So they get distracted a lot easier, and it affects the way they use the internet. And we're going to talk about more of that, about more related to performance, how it really corresponds to that. But the fact that most of the people who are involved in the tech industry are of that type, there is a bias. There is an inherent bias to very certain types of people. So they usually wouldn't think about people with disabilities. They wouldn't think about it. They would not be aware of it. So it's kind of like a chicken and an egg. I don't do accessibility because I don't expect people with disabilities to use my system, and vice versa. I don't. People with disabilities don't use my system because my system is not very much accessible to them. So it could work both ways. And yes, I think that you should consider the possibility that people with disabilities could use your system. And you should think about more of that. Yeah, if you make it more accessible, you have a larger audience base. Okay, you can immediately increase your customer base. Very simple.
Yeah. So when you say there are two kind of people who will be accessing your app or system or website. So as per my experience, so the application which I work, like the banking systems and medical, yes, they are very particular about this accessibility, even though it could be the end customers, which like a patients or the customer, like patient who is using the medical health website, that kind of things. And the second
Yeah.
part, like you mentioned, any tech engineer who is working for that website and operating two kind of users, I would think that, right?
I don't think it's two kinds of people. I think there are many kinds of people. Some are more capable, and some are less capable. And at the end of the extremes, people who are really need to take time to process the system are people with disabilities.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
it doesn't only have to be people with disabilities. It could be people who are old. They're not diagnosed with any disability, but they are less capable than your common QA engineer or the common performance engineer.
I think it would be better if you would have started like this, like whom this accessibility features meant for. Like, yeah, obviously it for elder people and disabled, but for whom? Like tech people who is working for that application, or the people who using that application, right?
It could be both.
It could be anyone.
It could be both. It could be that in some places you have people with disabilities who are software developers. It might well be. And if some tools are more, let's say GitHub is more accessible. If GitHub is more accessible, You could have people with disabilities doing software engineering. It could happen. So I think it happens both ways. I think it happens all around.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
think
So
accessibility is everywhere, Sid, actually. You see, if you go to any buildings, if you're using elevator, so there will be a button, right? So you can easily identify by closing your eyes for people who have visually challenged people, right? So
yeah,
accessibility is everywhere now. But only thing is
yeah,
we don't realize, we don't see it because we are like normal people, as Eldad mentioned.
yeah. But only
Actually,
the
we're
public
above
place
them.
visibility is
Uh,
like the best
I
example Eldad I would like to give is
mean,
like
uh,
ATM.
I would like to point it out a little bit further. People in the tech industry are above average in usually in intelligence, in abilities, in reading comprehension, in social economic status. We are above average. So it's very hard for us to think about those type of people. And again, it's not a blame. It's nothing to blame here. It's just a fact. We have a bias. We don't think about these people.
Correct.
It happens.
Yeah, and also you mentioned Eldad about GitHub, right? So GitHub, I think they are bringing features, more features for more accessibility, the color,
Absolutely.
and then the keyboard shortcuts for
Yes.
everything without using the mouse, right? So they are bringing a lot of features I have seen in the UI.
Absolutely, yes, we did, because it is important. And again, it's to point out that accessibility can harm, or lack of accessibility can harm people with disabilities in employment too. It can really shrink their employment opportunities.
True,
Correct.
Eldad. And the best example is like ATM. Like if you want to go to the ATM with you, if you don't withdraw money, the person is disabled. You can go through the voice instructions and get that done, right? So
Yeah, there are plenty of examples of that. I mean, today it's even easier because today you need less ATM. I mean, you have less needs for cash
yep,
today when you
yep,
have instant payment applications and stuff like that. It's even easier today.
yep.
Thank you.
And it's a business requirement. I think it's a business. Accessibility is a business. So I feel like if any website or application which is not considering accessibility, they are losing some lot of business.
They do.
I
I mean, it is mathematically impossible for them not to lose business if they're not accessible.
yeah. Thank.
Okay, so we have Rajesh. Hi, Rajesh. Thanks for joining. Yeah, if you have any questions, please ask.
Yeah, it's not like a question. Hi, Naveen. Thank you for this session, a wonderful session every weekend. Thanks,
Right?
Eldad.
Sure.
It's not a question, just like a discussion. Uh, I just had a thought. See, in my organization and even in many, multiple organizations, I've seen something called as ADA testing. Okay, something they do the testing on the devices, and with considering the accessibility, it is mostly as Eldad mentioned that it is for the people who doesn't have a proper like vision or hearing or anything. So they most of them depend upon the handheld devices. Okay, it is like the percentage of people using the regular desktop or laptop is considerably lower, and they'll be using other sorts of mobile devices or ipad. So we already have in iOS and Android something called as accessibility features and options. Okay,
Yes.
considering that, okay, that's, I mean, on the device wise and devices, they're already coming up with a lot of other options like this. Okay, that being said, uh, from the performance engineering and testing perspective, so what are the other parameters that we might, okay, need to consider for this ability to make sure that there are no glitches in the production? I mean, there are all, I mean, instead of talking about the functionalities or features, right? But it would be great if we can discuss about the performance related metrics and benchmarks that would impact these devices.
Yeah, that's coming up shortly.
Oh,
It does coming up.
okay,
First, want to talk about
great.
I do want to talk about functional testing tools because it is intertwined, and then we're going to talk about the performance aspects of this because they are a big part. As we all know, the way your application behaves with a single user or two users or even 10 users, suddenly when your application is under load, crazy things starts to happen, and accessibility can suffer too. That's the key idea here. So I do want to start talking about the functional testing, how that can be done, and then we can start talking about the performance issues. So usually the tactic here to tackle the issue of accessibility is either you have manual QA and they can come up with problems. Hey, if a person with vision disability or epilepsy, for example, if they look at this type of website, something can happen to them. Okay, or my cousin has PTSD. He took a look at this website and something happened to him. He started to feel shivers and stuff like that. So it could happen, but it's not robust. And of course, as we know, a ton of tests that can be automated because, as we said, there are 78 requirements by the official standard, the WCAG. So because there are 78 requirements and they are all measurable, they're very easy to check. So you can simply run a process that checks all of these requirements on your web page or web pages, depends on how complex your application is. And it could list up problems. It could list problems that your web application has when it runs. Okay, so for example, your contrasts are not matched, or you don't have really good text completion, and it's not robust enough because it doesn't conform with this or that standards. And one tool that I've been using, and it's quite successful, is called Axe. Axe is actually a linter that runs. It's a Node based application, but it also has a Python implementation, and it also has an executable. So it can run as an executable, and it could really list violations. Okay, so accessibility violations on your web page. So there is an article that I put up on Medium, and it's accepted by Better Programming. Hands-on example with Axe and Robot Framework, how you could first of all, use Selenium to navigate through your web pages, and then to check for accessibility problems or violations of accessibility standards. So that's pretty much the goal here. There is a report by the UK government that they were able to recognize 30 to 40% of their accessibility problems in their websites and in the government websites. And by the way, this is also a point. If you work for the government section, okay, so websites in the government section usually would have to be accessible. There's no other option for them. So so they were able to
sorry to interrupt, Eldad. That being said,
yeah,
it's it's your option, it's your choice, right? If you're not from the government website, you don't, whether you can care or you cannot care about the accessibility of your website.
it depends.
Right?
It depends on the laws that in the countries that you operate in. But you're taking a risk that way. If you work for a private company and you have a website and it's not accessible, you're taking a risk. You're taking a risk of a lawsuit.
Yeah, it is like a fire safety measurement for every organization. Like,
It is. Yes, you're reducing the risks for lawsuits.
Got it. Thanks.
So
the tool you said, it's Axeman or Axe?
Axe, AXE.
Yeah.
Okay, so AXE, accessibility testing, and most of the other tools that you're going to find are based on that. So you have the Axe core, it's the core functionality. It links the HTML document, and it provides you with violations. And
we do have
all the other tools are.
Yeah, we do have a tool, similar kind of tool with the same name, like Axeman, like it's a monitoring collection mode.
It's probably based on.
I was surprised whether it's related to that or not. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so generally this is the way to go. You run your browser, you run a linter on it. Okay, so this is the strategy of how you do that. So I think it's Rajesh who asked what do we need to do to make sure that we are controlling this linter. Of course, if you have lots of pages, then you're going to have to make a lot of executions of that. But it happens, so you don't really have to worry about it. Another way to do that here's another option: is to use computer vision. There are plenty of tools to do that you can use for free. You don't need to pay for anything. They're based on Tesseract OCR, so optic character recognition. So you can say something like, I know that my current website is well accessible. So what I'm going to do from now on, I'm going to make visual testing. I'm going to make visual comparisons, and I will assume that, oh, I see that someone brought up the link. Was it? Yeah, Naveen, it was you. Great, awesome. That's exactly it.
Yeah, thank
So,
you.
thank you. Yeah, so I can make a conjecture. I can kind of assume that any major diffs from the baseline could be considered as accessibility problems. Okay, so these are two ways to kind of do the same thing. One is more specific for accessibility, and the other one is kind of floating in the air. Accessibility is not really the main goal, but it could cover it up in some roundabout ways. Okay, Rajesh, does it answer your question about how can we make sure of this?
Yes, Eldad.
Yes,
Yeah.
Eldad. Yeah.
I was just something from the performance endpoint. I was just looking if there are any other client side metrics or something that would be relevant, as you mentioned in earlier, like some W3 standards, right? So that would really help. I mean, to know more about the client side performance benchmarks.
Yeah. So unfortunately, as I said, this is not yet well standardized. There is no real requirements for performance when it comes to accessibility. But here's where accessibility and performance really can meet each other. There is two ways. First of all, it is in the design of your load tests or your performance tests. So design of performance tests is about the workload model. Okay, and this is something that I think you covered with Nicole a few weeks ago. I think almost like 3 months ago, about realistic load testing or performance testing and workload models. Do you remember that, Naveen?
Which one? Eldad?
Which one, Eldad? With Nicole Van Verden.
Yes.
Yes.
From
Yeah.
K6, Grafana. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
from K6, and now K6 is owned by Grafana, of course. So workload models are a huge part of performance engineering. You need to understand what kind of people and things your application is going to serve. Okay, so more specifically in accessibility, you serve people. Okay, you don't serve devices with disability. You don't have such a thing. But you do serve people with disabilities. So what is one implication of that? Let's take one example is think time. Okay, so think time is very important when you serve people. Okay, so you want to create a workload model and you say, okay, we're going to have a think time of, let's say, 1 to 4 seconds, give or take, because I know from my experience, this is the time that it takes for the users around me to think after they click this button or they insert this text or what. But guess what? The people around you are very healthy young men, mostly men. There are some women in the tech industry, of course, but not most of them. And they are healthy people. They're intelligent. They're literate. They're strong. They are imaginative. They have good abstract thinking. They're not the average Joe. And of course, they're not people with disabilities. So your think times would have to have a greater range. You need to really insert into the think time the idea that you're going to have people with disabilities using the website, and that could have implications. Maybe when you wait for too long between two operations, something happened. Okay, something really nasty happens, especially when under load. That's one way. This is one way where performance and accessibility really meet in the workload modeling. When you think about those types of people, okay, that's one way it could go. What do you think about that, Naveen?
Yes,
That's right,
Eldad.
Eldad.
Actually, I started exploring about that website you mentioned, so I was just sidetracked. Nothing else.
What is it? What website?
That Axe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a linter. It has a set of rules that you can then run these rules against your website to see how well accessible it is. And now, as far as workload models, this should be part of the think time, because it's going to take longer for them to process the information. Sometimes it's going to take longer for them to move. Imagine a person with a neurodegenerative disorder like Parkinson, for example. It's going to take longer time for them to navigate through the website. So the think time has to be adaptable for this. It has to compensate for that. That's only one example.
Eldad,
Let us this. Again, say that I can't hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So what I was thinking, like, what is the priority of this accessibility when we consider into performance testing? Yeah, obviously workload model, the what percent of accessibility users are using this one. And I do have another thought, like accessibility, which kind of coming into more, which classified into the front end performance testing, whereas it will cover the
Yeah, we will cover
size,
that really soon. We will cover
colorblind.
that really soon.
Yeah. Don't you think it will fall under more into front end performance testing, and
Yes.
1% or little bit percent into workload modeling, the actual load testing, right?
Yeah. Well, this I wanted to get to that soon, because I do want to talk about the workload model, but it looks like it's kind of covered. We do understand that workload models are effective when we take into account those types of people. Now, when we talk about front end performance testing, there is one problem with that, and we already know what the problem is. The problem is that browsers tend to be very resource intensive. Last week, we talked about distributing performance testing. And one of the discussion that me and Naveen had is comparing, for example, Gatling with JMeter. And we concluded that JMeter is extremely resource intensive because it's thread based. So each user is a thread. And Gatling, for example, is very resource friendly because it's more event driven, kind of asynchronous IO. It's more resource friendly, so you could scale it up easier. Now, when we talk about front end performance testing, each user is a browser. Browsers are hungry hippos. They guzzle resources. They're extremely intensive as far as resources. So you're really going to be limited as to uh, how many instances of browser you could actually spin up, because each PC is going to take like 10 browsers a top, browser instances tops. Even if you use really powerful computers or machine or EC2 instances in AWS, so let's say 20, no more than that. It's going to be very costly. It's a very costly kind of test. So you could run performance testing for websites, and there are some matrices that you're going to measure. You could look at, for example, Lighthouse. Lighthouse has a good outlay of matrices for performance testing, and I think they have really good integration with Cypress. So they measure how long it takes for the first element to load, how long it takes for the largest element to load, and how long does it take for the page to be interactive. And there are some more matrices that they measure, but these are usually the measurements that you're going to see in front-end performance testing. But again, the load is going to be significantly lower when you compare to API load testing, because APIs are very easy to scale. Browsers are very difficult to scale. Now, Sid, go ahead.
Sorry,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt
sorry.
you there. So don't you think accessibility is meant for end users who are using that system?
Yes, it is.
So then it will classify into the more into the front end performance testing. But yeah, what kind
But
of device it's using, it's up to them, right? So how the app is responding when the accessibility users are using. that is a point for the
There are
performance.
other ways to do that. Well, you can do that with browsers, and that's going to be very resource intensive. You can combine the two. So you can spin up, let's say, a single test instance with APIs and another test instance with browsers. So you can have like 10 browsers and 20,000 APIs or API users. And now your system is under load, and you can still conduct performance testing on the website, on the actual website, and you could integrate that with accessibility testing. Lighthouse has the ability to do that. You can do this in conjunction in a single place. With Redline 13, for example, I have a lot of experience with Redline 13 because I've been using them for over 4 years. I know they're extremely flexible, so you can add a lot of things to them, and I've added a lot of things to them. So one example would be you could, for example, use JMeter to download the HTML from the website, and then you run Axe on that HTML. Okay, so you don't need to spin up the browser. The browser is a hungry hippo. It takes resources like crazy, but you can download the HTML and run a accessibility checker on that HTML. So it kind of saves the burden of spinning up lots of browsers. Again, you have also the issue of authentication. So you can still do that. You can send a authentication request, get the token or whatever, download the HTML, and run the accessibility checker. It requires more coding. It requires more technical coding, but it is doable. It is possible.
But still, there is a limitation, right, Eldad? For example, if you take a website like a single page website application, right? So if you run JMeter, it will just download the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right?
True.
But
True.
it will not execute anything on the JavaScript front.
Absolutely.
It will not even send any event. So you say, for example, Netflix website, right? It's a single page application. So it will download the skeleton, but it will not do actually anything on that.
True. So in this case, if it is important, if you have lots of JavaScript scripts to run, then you are reluctant to use browsers, but you're going to combine API based. You could do that. It's one possibility to run API based load tests and then browser based load tests. With browsers being like 10 instances or whatever you're capable of, depending on how much funding you have to run many browsers, and the APIs would load the system. So it's still not perfect, but it still can give you a good idea of how well you perform with regards to accessibility.
Correct. So usually what I do is I put a 1% or 2% of load from the browser and remaining 98% to the APIs, and then I execute concurrently. So both the scripts will run concurrently, and then the performance will have the mix and match of both from the UI and also the backend.
Yeah, that's one way to go. We do that too. It's well, in the business that I work for today, it's mostly Internet of Things stuff. But we work with animals intelligence. So we have tags on animals, for example, on cows or dogs, and it collects matrices on their health state. So it's more Internet of Things, and it's more steady state. But of course, there are people. People use the application too, like the farmer or the pet owner. So we kind of have to do both things at the same time. So we have tests where we slam the system with things. It's the Internet of Things realm, and then we collect reports that should be consumed by humans. And we do this by 2 tests running at the same time, and then we correlate all the matrices together. It's a very complex topic, but performance engineering is complex.
Yep, yes, Eldad. So one straight point here, maybe Naveen or anybody else. So what do you think this accessibility overhead and the performance in terms of backend in front of front end? Where do you categorize this one? So what I feel like when like you just discussed, should we consider this accessibility parameters like a CSS JavaScripts which will be loading when we using the website, or do we need to categorize into separate entity?
See,
How do you think?
from my view till now, whatever we discussed, right? So it is absolutely my view. So my view is backend doesn't discriminate anybody, right? Because backend doesn't know unless you are specifically sending some tag information whether the person is visually challenged or physically challenged, right? So backend serves everybody same unless the with respect to the location, right? So if I am closest to the location, it will serve fast. If I am very far, it will serve based on the latency. So server doesn't discriminate. So what I think is this accessibility comes in the front end layer, front end
Correct. That
performance
is my
testing.
strong opinion, Naveen. So that's what I feel. It is like a similar,
Yes.
I mean, browser parameter, how strong you are using, how strong is your end user, how strong is your browser, how strong is your device, which is supporting the accessibility feature. Yes,
Not only,
even I have
not only,
the
not,
same
not
feeling.
only. Okay. Yes. Functionally wise, um, the backend side is completely ignorant of the person. It simply receives data and retrieves data, and that's it. It's not discriminative of people. It doesn't know that who is a person and who is a robot, unless you have CAPTCHA. But CAPTCHA is part of the front end. However, if your backend is not performant, then strange things can happen on the front end side. Okay, and that's the point. The point is not that the accessibility occurs either on the back end or the front end. The point here is that poor backend performance could lead to poor user experience, and one of the areas that could be affected is accessibility.
So that is what Eldad. So what we are thinking is like, see, as a performance engineering, most of us will concentrate about your server and infrastructure, your backend completely. So we categorize these kind of things front end. So what type of users, what type of features you are accessing, it is completely into falls into client side, right? The end customers.
Yeah, the check itself, the actual check of accessibility occurs on the client side, of course.
Yeah, that's what we are talking about. When we
So
say
you have
front
to
end,
distribute the load in a variety of fashion.
yeah,
People with accessibility, people without accessibility, and then people very far from, and with a very powerful internet connection. So our workload profile should have all the mix and match combination.
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
maybe
that's the
worst
point.
case scenario like that, like what is the max scenario we can add that 1% or 10%, what worst peak scenario in terms of
Mhm.
accessibility,
Well,
what they will face,
in
right?
general terms, as I mentioned earlier, the World Health Organization estimates around 13% of world's population uh, living with one form or another of disability.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense. Yep.
that kind of gives a good hunch to what we're talking about. But of course, it really depends on where you're at, what kind of people you tend to serve. So I think that if you talk about the workload modeling, you need to remember that workload models are constantly being revised and corrected. So you need to first start with the assumption. I think a good place to start from is 10% people with disabilities who have greater think times or greater uh, times to operate or time to process. And then you can correct for that by looking at analytics in your production environment, and you always carve your workload model accordingly.
Yeah, so it's basically you're talking about you're designing your scenario for accessibility person. And
Yeah,
basically, and one more thing is like even accessibility features, they do interact the same APIs and app as a backend, right?
absolutely. Yeah, they fetch
Yeah,
that data. That's all they do.
yeah, true.
So
So what we are thinking, Naveen, like what I understand, it's completely like my understanding. Just correct me, you guys. So we have to design a scenario of like a disabled person, how they use and how much think time they can expect, and it's completely feel like it's completely designing the scenario for the accessibility features separately.
correct.
Yes. Well, if you set the think time for each thread in the, I'm taking JMeter because I know it's a JMeter oriented.
Anywhere
Um, uh,
the think time is there, that you can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So if you set a think time per thread, you could randomize from a random function or a density function that would take this into account. Let's say you estimate that the think time would be kind of normally distributed, but with a little bit left side skewness. And this left side skewness would be those people with disability. Okay, so it takes longer for them to process and to think. So this is how you can account for this. You can make a random function that is kind of a normal distribution, but with a left side skewness. And this way you could generate different types of users who have different think times.
So Eldad, I can give you one example. Yesterday I faced actually. So I have posted in LinkedIn also. I don't know whether you seen it or not. So with Walmart.com. So yesterday I was trying to place an order. Okay, for every simple search, the CAPTCHA checks were coming up. Okay, so Walmart, I don't know whether you see it or not. In the Walmart, they recently implemented this robot or human kind of check. So it is not a Google CAPTCHA. It is you have to press and hold the button for about 7 seconds, 7 to 8 seconds. Okay. So every search, if I am searching for tomatoes, right? Again, I need to search. I have to press and hold that button. Okay. And if I search for milk, again it is popping up. And after I added all the items to the cart, and when I click on checkout, again that check is coming up. So I think if a person who is very disabled with the fingers or some kind of fracture in the fingers, right? So they cannot keep holding the button and keep pressing it just to pass the check.
Well, I think about, first of all, people with autism, for example. They would be very frustrated to see that.
Correct. Even I got frustrated. I posted it in Twitter and I posted in LinkedIn.
But
I mean,
at
think
the same point,
you're
the website has to think for the security as well, right?
Yeah,
well,
security, but not for every search, right? They can ask before checkout, just for the malicious activities, but not for every item search.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I understand that the security needs are absolutely important. And if you look at CAPTCHAs, they usually have a text alternative, so you could have a voice or audio CAPTCHA stuff. But this thing will be very frustrating, even for a highly technically skilled people like you. It is frustrating. So imagine a person with autism. Okay, he gets frustrated very easily, and for them to experience that, and especially when they're not so flexible for changes, people with autism are not flexible to changes.
Correct.
To face this kind of thing, it really makes them feel excluded.
Correct. I mean, actually, I didn't place the order. They lost one order.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eldad, Naveen, I have a thought. Maybe you could correct me on my suggestion. So it may sound like discrimination, but how about having a separate? So why don't we mix? Why should we mix with this accessibility feature with normal end users with impaired users? Why don't we have a separate entity for them? Does it sound like a discrimination or something?
No. Actually, we don't really say that this meant for people with disabilities, because it's meant for everyone, even for you. If you want to do a voice-based CAPTCHA, do it. You're not barred from this. But making the environment more accessible to people with disabilities is not discrimination. On the contrary,
That is
we're
the
giving.
main goal, right? So what I feel like, if you think that this is really would be a overhead for the performance in terms of performance or security, so why don't we give a separate entity? Because for them, if any person using like a colorblind or impaired, voice impaired, any kind of person, they could have a separate app or web entity for them, right? So that it
It's
won't
not
impact
necessary.
on your performance.
No, it's not necessary, as Eldad mentioned, right, Sid? We can just toggle on and off. If you want some mode, you can just toggle on so that it will be transformed to their mode.
No,
So separate entity is not
in terms of
financially
load,
possible, right?
I'm talking, Naveen. So when there is a load, so the whole point of the this topic is having what is the overhead when we have the load on the system, what is the impact of availability, right? I mean
Yeah.
accessibility.
Yeah.
So why don't
So
we like you said, the toggling is okay, but when it that will be suitable when there was no load or everything is cool, like Black Friday situations. They could be overridden, right? These
yeah.
accessibility could be overridden by the remaining security features, load, because every business people or at the end of the day, they want to see the revenue. They don't care whether it's coming from them, right?
Correct. It depends on the audience, right? You have to learn your audience. Then you can distribute the workload. It is not, we cannot follow some thumb rule like 10% or 20%, right?
Exactly.
So for example, if there is a dedicated website only for disability, so 100% workload for them,
Yeah,
right?
that's what my feeling. So it's always better to give a separate priority for that kind of people. Even
Yes, we
could
have to
be
learn the audience about the analytics. Then we can distribute the load.
Yeah, I mean, I think that 10% of people with disabilities or people with longer think times, okay, usually they are going to be a big part of this. Okay, so people with longer think time, 10% is a good place to start, but it has to be constantly analyzed and revised.
But longer think time doesn't mean they have people or disability, right? People with old age also, they might also
Yeah,
take some long time to fill the form. Correct.
yes, absolutely. And web accessibility in particular also discuss people who are just old, people who it takes longer for them. Maybe they're not officially diagnosed with a disability, but a website that is not suitable for them would harm their experience.
And longer think times, I don't think it will be a performance. Obviously, at the end of the day, we will be looking the response times, right? So even if it's get response time get delayed, as they are having more longer think time, I don't think it will be impacted in the performance.
Well, it might be true, but we need to test it. We better test it. Maybe there is some internal logic in the backend server that is based on time, so like a token or something like that. And after the token expires, something happens. Okay, it could be some performance bugs. So it's better be tested and not assumed.
And one more important feature I would like to discuss, like this accessibility. So if like Naveen mentioned earlier, it's not only for the first page what you're seeing. It is for Rajesh, somebody mentioned, right? So
Yes.
it is for every page, every API what you're requesting. So
No, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be.
yeah,
You can look at, let's say, the top 10 most viewed components of your website, and you test them, and you might be good enough. It might be good enough.
yep, makes sense.
And again, when you combine accessibility and performance testing, you don't have to blast your system with maximal load. Okay, just take a portion of your load, a load that is realistic for production environment, and correlate that with accessibility. That's usually the use case.
Correct. So Eldad, I have one question here. So have you come across any APM or observability tools where they give a separate profile for this kind of workload analysis?
That's a really, really good question. If they give some load analysis for accessibility issues?
Yes. Like, see, Lighthouse we have, right? Lighthouse we have the accessibility section.
Yeah.
But do we have anything for in the APM tools or observability tools?
No, I have not seen that. I think that behind the scenes, Lighthouse runs Axe or something like that. I
So
believe
it's a
so.
feature idea for APM and observability tools.
Yeah, it is.
There
And
is
I
a
think
tool,
that
Naveen, that Adobe, maybe Adobe will give the classified all this kind.
It's APM or observability? What section it falls?
Observability. It's a log
well, that
analysis kind of started with log analysis, production analysis, and now it's fallen under observability in Adobe.
Any tool name? What is the tool name?
Just Adobe. Adobe.
No, Adobe, they have multiple products, right?
it's
Uh,
for it's for PDF accessibility, I think.
No, I'm asking the APM and observability. See, we have Dynatrace, Neural Lake, right? So within the interface, I'm just looking for a place where I can see the accessibility issues.
Yeah, it's actually a really good feature. I think it's a really good feature to have.
Yeah, I never seen anything in Neuralink or Dynatrace. That's why I'm asking this.
Yeah, again, remember, this is very novel stuff. So it's not perfectly standardized. So we have lots of things to understand. We're expecting a new revision of YTAG very soon in mid 2022. So, yeah.
And also no SEO feature. SEO also I never seen anything in Neuralink or Dynatrace.
Again, I couldn't hear you. There was a lag for a moment.
No,
What is
I'm
it
talking about
again?
SEO, search engine optimization. So
Okay.
those features also not there in any APM or observability tools.
Yeah. So I think there is a lot of integration to do to get the accessibility into more observability stuff and open telemetry and all these realms. I think there's going to be a lot of work done in this area. One more thing that I would like to add, I think we start to see the beginning of this. I know you're familiar to.
Sorry, we lost you, Eldad.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, so you're familiar to Flood.io by Tricentis.
Yes.
Okay, so they offer UI-based load tests. They're very successful at that. Very recently, they acquired Testim.io. Testim.io is an AI solution for self-healing automation for browsers. Now, I would have to give a disclaimer first. The CEO and founder of Testim.io is a good friend of mine, Oren Rubin. So disclaimer before. But recently, Tricentis purchased Testim.io, and Testim.io has been very successful in integrating accessibility testing into their framework. So I think,
Flit.io, the framework is Element, correct, Eldad?
yeah, they have an entire tool chain for low code or no code automation.
Okay, because yeah, Flit.io, I have seen some GitHub repositories for the UI testing, but
Yeah.
it's not been very active nowadays. I don't know whether they are going to drop. I'm not sure. So just sharing.
Flood.io?
Not yeah, Flit.io's Element. There is a framework called Element. So that Element is the UI based testing framework performance. So
Okay,
that repo is not active from past many months.
okay. Okay, I'm not familiar to Element
Okay,
specific.
it's a Flit.io's framework only.
Okay, so, because Cloud.io has a SaaS application, so maybe
Offering,
they
yeah,
have.
SaaS offering, but they have this framework as well.
Okay, okay, but anyway, point is because they purchased Testim.io, I think that the integration between them would yield a lot of options for performance and accessibility testing using AI solutions.
Got it. So they give all kinds of reports like whatever Access giving, similar reports.
Yes, yes. They actually go in more details than that because they use a lot of computer vision to fine tune those problems.
Oh, okay, yeah, they have product for Salesforce also. I'm just seeing it.
Testim.io, yeah.
Yeah, Testimony, yeah. Cool.
So, Eldad, when you tested with this testing IO with Tricentis, what kind of reports
They
you
have only
got?
recently been purchased. It hasn't
Oh,
started.
okay,
It,
okay.
it, it has only been
Yeah,
announced.
last week I also posted said in my LinkedIn
Yeah,
about this acquisition. Yeah.
yeah. It's a good acquisition. I think we're going to see a lot of good tools coming up there.
So, what kind of reports we can expect from this accessibility kind of testing, performance testing?
You're usually going to get a table with a with one column being the violation itself. Okay, so what has been violated, and they're going to show you a link to a more detailed explanation about this violation, what it means, who does it going to affect, and you're going to get a severity, so being severe, moderate, or low, and you're going to get the element, the DOM element where it occurs. So it's going to identify by either ID or XPath or any other ways. That's what you usually should expect.
Thanks, Eldad.
Sure.
So any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand so that I can admit to the stage. So any other topic you would like to cover, Eldad? So we have covered a lot of things. So any more topics from your end?
No, I think I ran out of topics.
Cool. Yeah, that was very insightful, Eldad. I mean, approaching performance from different point of view, right? So it's different. I mean, not many of us are doing that, frankly speaking. So yeah, we should talk to our product owners, right? For the upcoming sprints, probably you can engage with them, and then we can bring something from the accessibility front. I think there will be a team dedicated for accessibility, but not from performance perspective. So that's what I have seen from my experience.
Yeah, it's true. There is not a lot of information there. You need to come up with things on your own and put them out there into the world, and to have people coming with other ideas, and you can compare them together. I think that's the way to start.
Correct. So thank you, Eldad. So this session is being recorded and it is available anytime. You can watch, listen in Clubhouse. So before we sign off, this week's sponsor is Redline 13. If you want to run high scale load testing, please check it out, redline13.com. And next week, I'm coming up with some interesting topic. So stay tuned. Please watch the GitHub repository and LinkedIn post for the announcement. Thank you, guys. Have a great weekend, and thank you, Eldad, for the insightful session.
My pleasure, always.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, guys. See you next week. Bye.
If you like my dad's videos, please subscribe to QA Insights channel.